Afro-Colombians of the Cauca developed a series of martial arts styles, collectively referred to as grima, that utilized the unarmed body, the stick, the azagaya, or the machete as primary weapons. Built upon African diaspora combat traditions, the foundational grima styles provided an education in both extreme corporal dexterity and malicia, meaning cunning or trickery, on the level of strategy and tactics. Experts in grima were crucial to the defense of maroon communities in the Colombian Cauca, especially La Banda, which will be the focus of this talk. Maroon communities, or palenques as they were known locally, were populations who had liberated themselves by escaping bondage to live independently in more remote areas. In addition to the physical and tactical skills of grima, these communities also placed a premium on ancillary spiritual empowerment through a number of methods, but the most popular or the most iconic being pacts with the Virgin Mary or the Afro-Colombian devil. Reliance on the latter figure is fascinating because this was a professedly Christian community. Yet they relied on fighting men who made pacts with the Afro-Colombian devil to lead their military resistance against various groups of whites who sought to deprive them of their freedom, land, or livelihood at different time periods. This paper seeks to explore the fighters' pacts with the Afro-Colombian devil as a community resource for this Christian maroon community. Just as a side note, I had originally planned to explore this through West Central African community ethics. But for time constraints, I'm going to have to focus myself just on the Colombian practice so that I stay within time. The region known as La Banda was first established as a secondary palenque. The primary palenque had been settled in the 17th century by large numbers of bondsmen who escaped slavery in the mines around Barbacoas and the surrounding regions. They fled to the region of the primary palenque, which was to the south of La Banda, which had at one point been used by natives as a prison. This was a natural fortress that, and it became a beacon to attract other followers, other people to run away from bondage from as far away as Panama. By the early 18th century, the maroon community had been comprised of at least two distinct communities of Nagao and Nachao, and these became beacons. These had been a focal point of refuge for people of African descent primarily, but also some whites and natives fleeing the government for other reasons. Now, as fugitives arrived to this primary community, they would be enculturated there, but eventually some people began to spread out from the primary palenque and form secondary palenques. The first of these was La Banda, which was well suited to both herding cattle and growing subsistence crops such as yucca, plantains, and corn. Always wary of punitive actions by the wider society, Maroons had to be alert militarily. Nachao and Nagoa, as we mentioned, had been defended by this very sharp escarpment, and other secondary palenques were defended by multiple rivers that made surprise attack impossible, and access to these areas was only available at certain times of the year. La Banda did stand atop a gentle escarpment that provided a visual forewarning of advancing troops that would have to ford the river below. But besides this and some thorny bushes, the Maroons of La Banda did not have the same level of natural barriers as some of these other places, and thus relied heavily upon a martial ethos that both prepared the community for warfare and advertised its preparation to help prevent incursions in the first place. At the heart of this martial ethos was the social elevation of valientes, who proved themselves with grima fighting skills on the physical level, but were also protected by supernatural forces. At the end of the 18th century, officials in the nearby capital wrote to the Spanish king complaining about the blacks in the area of La Banda. And among other things, they complained about their emphasis on machete dueling and about their fascination with the valiant deeds of the valientes, and everyone's preoccupation with becoming one. In regards to dueling, La Banda itself has some of the deepest grima lineages in Colombia, suggesting that it may have been the home of one of the oldest still existing grima styles in Colombia. In addition to their grima and milicia skills, most valientes were also protected by supernatural forces known as ventajas, or advantages. While Edic or outsider perspectives of these ventajas are dismissive at best, my ethnography of Afro-Colombian martial arts seeks to explore these practices from an insider perspective that relies heavily both on African and Afro-Colombian notions of the spiritual and social realms. For locals of La Banda, these ventajas stood at the heart of the martial ethos that fostered the elevation of heroic braves through displays of their physical prowess, tactical cunning, and demonstrations of the spiritual aids that augmented their abilities. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a clear hierarchy of valentia, with most community members being what is known as jugadores, or proficient machete players trained in the foundations, usually through friends and relatives. Formally trained fighters known as entregados or maestros, graduates or masters, were graduates from the academies of the various styles of grima. Of these, a smaller subsection of experts graduated from a style with the addition of spiritual aid. In La Banda, for example, Master Biafra offered his students a range of grima styles, each which had its own tuition. And this tuition was augmented if the student chose to learn from the master, and additionally, one or more ventajas to complement their physical training. The valientes who chose this option were thus empowered with various skills such as the ability to fight in complete darkness, invisibility, etc. Among these valientes, the community of La Banda most admired those who used their skills on behalf of the community. These people were called men of history. The skills that they demonstrated publicly in festivals encouraged the belief that they had indeed acquired ventajas. These men of history often attracted a network of followers and family members who served as a community defense force organized along matrilineal lines. While there were at least 10 sources of ventajas available for those seeking advantages, the most iconic of these in the popular imagination was Pacts with the Afro-Colombian devil. The most famous of the valientes were those individuals who made special pacts with spiritual forces in exchange for ventajas. One of the most sought-after powers in La Banda was the ability to disappear or escape from one's enemies. Quote, with respect to this phenomenon, there were two versions. One says that using a special prayer, the devotee became invisible because the Virgin Mary protected him with her mantle. The other affirms that because of a pact with the devil, one acquires the ability to transform oneself into an object or animal, unquote. These two were the primary sources of spiritual aid in La Banda. Devotees of the Virgin Mary saw her as a powerful patroness over combat, following a tradition not only stemming out of Sicily, but also a tradition well established in the Kingdom of Congo. While the Virgin would protect warriors devoted to her in combat, she also limited their actions to just combat following a strict moral code. This alliance with the Virgin was the most popular and widespread of the sacred ventajas. On the other hand, were those known as empautados, or pact makers, who made profane pacts with the Afro-Colombian devil. These empautados loom large in the memorialization of Labanda's history and culture because they were respected and embraced by the community as men of history. Demonic pacts were seen as the most powerful of ventajas in terms of the range of powers that it conferred. They were also the most difficult to acquire. Only valientes who could successful only valientes could successfully become empautados, since it was an arduous process that required a series of difficult challenges. While there were exceptional ways to make pacts via guide, the typical pattern followed the local cultural calendar. The primary opportunity arose only once a year during Holy Week. On a hill just north of Labanda, which is you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, on that hill, during Holy Thursday, it was believed that between midnight and 3 a.m., a cave would open up on the hill. There, the aspirant would enter and face a number of challenges. They would have to fight off demons in the form of bears, wolves, or tigers. And if they survived these and other tests, they would then be led into the innermost cave, where they would make a pact with the devil to hand over their souls on a given day, and choose the various powers that they would have until that point. They would then return to the community and openly demonstrate their powers during the various festivals of the community, particularly the festival of Our Lady of Valle, the most important festival of the year. The oral traditions of the community memorialized a series of empautados who revealed themselves to the community at the feast. The Festival of Our Lady opened with religious activities, but then spanned 8 days of drinking, dancing, and competitive entertainments that included the wider region's largest horse races, bullfights, wrestling competitions, and grima tournaments. During the era of these men of history, a number of grimistas who became empautados first gained renown at these festivals. Now, coming down to the second half of the 19th century, many of these empautados in this time period stood on the shoulders of a empautado referred to as the general. He was a free descendant of maroons, but born during the era of slavery. During the first half of the 19th century, the military prowess of Labanda and the neighboring communities allowed the maroon community to survive the various assaults during the period of slavery. They distinguished themselves on the battlefield, particularly during independence struggles. And because of their demonstrated martial prowess, they not only gained retained and made official their freedom, but also by the second half of the 19th century, the white property owners began progressively abandoning their properties in such a way that blacks became owners of the majority of the valley. This was remembered as a time when cattle and access to meat abounded. Now, cattle was an important food resource and cultural element to these former maroon communities in the second half of the 19th century. A few blacks in the region became large property owners, and many more claimed land through a black tenancy system. And even poor blacks without land could graze their own cattle on public pasture lands. General Angulo served as a bridge between the traditions of maroon leaders during the last decades of slavery and their descendants in the second half of the 19th century. He became one of the most powerful empautados in terms of the wide range of powers he acquired. Beyond having great combat abilities, he had the strength to lift a mule, he could outdrink all rivals during festivals, he was the best player of the local musical instrument, he could charm any woman he met during the festival, and he was the fastest horse racer. He was known locally as the General because he served as a guide to a series of later generations of valientes who successfully made pacts with the devil under his tutelage. The last and most famous of these disciples was the Empautado Sinforoso, we'll talk about momentarily. While the decades after abolition in 1852 was a time of relative peace, prosperity, and independence for these former maroon communities, there were still times of need. The nature of the agricultural cycle meant that October, January, and occasionally late April were times of nutritional crisis when the earlier crop stores would be running thin before the next harvest would come in. Empautados like the General and Sinforoso helped redistribute access to food for the needy of the community during these times. Due to his power and influence, the General established a set of compromises between the wealthy black landowners and the rest of the black community. On the one hand, he was charged with the protection and care of the landlord's cattle, particularly on the largest hacienda of the region. In exchange for this service, he had the right to take from these haciendas dairy products that he would then distribute in times of crisis. And then, particularly during the times of major festivals, he would also take cattle, which would be slaughtered and distributed as meat to feed the wider community. Sinforoso carried out a similar role in distribution of food much later in the 19th century and early 20th centuries. Now, Sinforoso was also the most famous Empautado, in part because he used his grima malicia to outfox the devil himself. He discipled under the General to make a pact that would end with the devil killing him and taking his soul at the festival of Our Lady. According to the local accounts, he and the devil, on his last day, got drunk and began riding around the town square, while the others were in church services that opened the festival. In one of their passes around the square, he juked out the devil and rode his horse right into the church, screaming, confession, Father, or the devil will take me." The officiating priest immediately granted him a confession with a very stern penance, while the devil could only make a ruckus outside the church door. Although the priest issued him a super harsh penance, and the devil later struck his body in vengeance, Sinforoso completed his penance and survived. The community heralded him not just for escaping the clutches of the devil, but also for having provided for the people around him while he had been in Empautado. In conclusion, as we have seen, valientes with ventajas played an important role in defense of La Banda, both from exterior threats such as slave hunters and armies trying to recapture the community in the time of slavery, and dealing with community needs such as hunger in later generations. From the community's formation until the 1940s, individuals with physical combat skills and spiritual protections continued to rise to become community leaders during times of crisis. Among these, even valientes who became empautados with the devil were heralded for their heroics. They risked their own lives and even souls for powers to feed and defend their communities. They were thus heralded for their selfless sacrificial service to the community. Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers of this event. I look forward to your questions.